What's your view on the ketogenic diet?
Virtually impossible.
We are not herbivores.
Two very popular scientists who get millions of views with best-selling books, who are both very persuasive. If you're not a scientist, how can you tell who to trust? 2 weeks ago, I made an episode about how food myths spread by following a popular scientist talk and checking his references. It's not that I like doing it, I don't. But you don't have the time, and I'm a retired scientist, and if I don't do it, who will? And you keep sending me a torrent of fact-checking requests because the internet keeps sending you a torrent of misinformation. On the good news front, after the last episode, I heard from several of the world's most highly regarded nutrition scientists. Christopher Gardner of Stanford retweeted the episode and called it fascinating and engaging. Another famous one who doesn't want to tangle with the misinformers said, "What you've done here is extraordinary." I can't tell you how much that meant to me because that was a hard episode emotionally. I got a tepid response from Nina Teicholz, who I had mentioned in the episode, who asked if someone could tell her what it said because she didn't have time to watch it. And best-selling author Gary Taubes asked me to write it all out so he didn't have to watch. But to Dr. Diamond's credit, the scientist whose talk was the center of the episode, he watched it and wrote a long response. I'm happy because I'd like to know what I got wrong so I can correct it, and I don't want to be a vector of misinformation. And I'd love to better understand his thinking. I was off social media for a week, and he even pressed me to respond. The first point he made was, Chompers opened by showing my paper on whether statin use is justified for someone on a low-carb, high-fat diet, but he never addressed any of the issues we covered. Instead, he critiqued a talk I gave 8 years ago. That's a legit issue. I had watched 7 of his talks and interviews and chose that one for a few reasons. First, I had promised you wouldn't need any science to understand the episode, and for that talk, you didn't. His later talks are more technical.
So the population that has heart disease has significantly more fibrinogen and factor VIII. These are 2 important proteins that are involved in clotting.
Second, he doubled down on that talk 6 years ago, and I haven't seen him correct anything.
That's right there saying saturated fat really does not cause heart disease.
And third, he really went after someone most nutrition scientists revere.
He made this up. It's amazing. He's being interviewed. He is seen as an expert. And I point out as well, he didn't take a single course in cardiovascular disease or nutrition in college. He had a bachelor's degree in economics and a PhD in fish physiology.
And if you know me, you know I will defend scientists whom I believe to be great. But point taken, at the end of this episode, I'll try to discuss some of the issues he covered in his paper and some of his more recent talks. I also have to say, he looks good on his low-carb diet. He says he used to be overweight when he ate carbs, and he posted a photo. Here's his next point. Chris states, I have genetically high cholesterol. No. I have a tendency towards high triglycerides, which is expressed when I consume carbs. That's a good correction, and I apologize for getting that wrong. If you're wondering how I could get something so fundamental like that wrong, his episodes were all about LDL, and he made statements like,
Once my triglycerides went low enough that you could measure my LDL, turns out it was extremely high.
So as I was talking, the LDL piece was top of mind, but no excuses, I got it wrong. In the previous episode, he emphasized Banting's 1863 letter on corpulence.
So they eliminated potatoes, bread, and sugar, but he was allowed to eat as much meat and other animal products as he wanted.
I pointed out there were many diet books before that, and Dr. Diamond neglected to mention that Banting also eliminated buttermilk, and in the 3rd edition, pork as too fattening, along with veal and salmon. Dr. Diamond responded, Chompers can focus on whether others wrote about diet and health, but what matters is that Banting was the first one to be obese and to write a book about what he did about it. The primary diet components he reduced or eliminated: potatoes, bread, sugar, and beer, all of which are high in carbs. That response really shook me up, and I haven't been able to get it out of my head all week. What Banting eliminated is in black and white.
The items from which I was advised to abstain were bread, butter, milk, sugar, beer, and potatoes.
I can understand how Gary Taubes could misrepresent Banting in 2007 before Google Books put it online for all to see and someone else published it in print. I'll share my hypothesis at the end of this episode on why someone would double down on something that is such obvious misinformation. But instead of quibbling about the words, the historical context is probably the most important thing. Banting was an undertaker with no background in nutrition, writing an anecdote about himself, just like the ones we see every day on social media. But there were many books on corpulence written throughout the ages, written by respected doctors at least 50 years before Banting came out with his.
Cursory remarks on corpulence or obesity considered as a disease, with a critical examination of ancient and modern opinions relative to its causes and cure. Third edition, containing a reference to the most remarkable cases that have occurred in this country, by William Wade, surgeon, 1816.
Doesn't that sound more credible to you? A few years later, Dr. Wad was appointed to
Surgeon Extraordinary to the King.
Here's a book first read to the Royal Society of London in 1757.
A discourse on the nature, causes, and cure of corpulency, illustrated by a remarkable case, by Malcolm Fleming, M.D.
Here's another 30 years before that.
A discourse concerning the causes and effects of corpulency, together with the method for its prevention and cure, by Thomas Short, M.D.
My granddaughter Caitlin got a big laugh out of one of the opening lines of Thomas Short's book.
I believe in no age should ever afford more instances of corpulency than our own. Ha! Fat chance.
So Dr. Wad famously searched opinions from experts ancient and modern for his book. What did he find? Here's one of many case studies he reported.
A country tradesman, aged about 30, of a short stature, and naturally of a fresh, sanguine complexion, and very fat, applied to me for assistance. I advised him immediately to quit all animal food, to live solely on vegetables, and everything prepared from them, allowed him a glass of wine or a beer occasionally, but chiefly to confine himself to water. He pursued the plan very scrupulously, lost his redundant fat, grew active as usual in about 6 months. I recommended a perseverance for a few months longer, then to allow himself light animal food once or twice a week, and gradually to fall into his usual way of living. He grew well and continued so.
Isn't that the wisdom of thousands of years of slender, long-lived people from the Mediterranean to Asia? Dr. Diamond's next point was to challenge Adventist epidemiology and claim Mormons are actually the longest-lived group in the U.S. Here's the thing, Brandolini's law applies here. The amount of energy needed to refute misinformation is an order of magnitude bigger than that needed to produce it. If people want the whole story, I can make other episodes, but in the meantime, I'm going to have to take it on the chin from Dr. Diamond for cherry picking, as he did for my previous 39-minute episode, which Nina and Gary said was too long to watch. First, Mormons. Their founding health code right in their scriptures is called the Word of Wisdom.
Yea, flesh also of beasts and of the fowls of the air, I, the Lord, have ordained for the use of man with thanksgiving. Nevertheless, they are to be used sparingly. And it is pleasing unto me that they should not be used only in times of winter, or of cold, or famine.
Most Mormon members, unlike Adventists, have moved away from those scriptures in recent years, led in part by Dr. Diamond's co-author of his paper, nutrition professor Ben Bikman, who is a devout Mormon. He doesn't hold back about what he believes.
Well, I am vehemently opposed to veganism in every way, shape, or form. So I'll make that incredibly clear up front. I think that it is completely antithetical to human development and human survival.
But Mormons have become known for their obesity crisis, which is widely covered in the media. When speaking at Church University BYU, Dr. Bikman acknowledges their problems.
Members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints are not spared from the plagues of prosperity, these chronic diseases that stem from insulin resistance. In fact, evidence suggests we may suffer from them more than members of other religions.
But he too is a spreader of misinformation and may have influenced Dr. Diamond. This is what he says about the Word of Wisdom.
We should be wary of well-intentioned voices that claim to promote a word of wisdom diet. There is no such thing.
But here's what the church has on their website. And here is the official church program they tailor for different areas of the world. You can see from the photo what they encourage. Speaking about diet and church leaders, Dr. Bikman said this at Brigham Young University, where he works.
Prophets and apostles have divinely interpreted the application of the word of wisdom to include avoiding a short list of habit-forming substances, but they've not gone further, nor should we.
But Brigham Young the man was the second president of the church, and this is what he actually said in the church's general conference as president of the church.
If the people were willing to receive the true knowledge from heaven in regard to their diet, they would cease eating swine's flesh. The beef fed upon our mountain grasses is as healthy food as we need at present. Beef, so fattened, is as good as wild meat, and is quite different in its nature from stall-fed meat. Fish is as healthy a food as we can eat, if we accept vegetables and fruit, and with them will become a very wholesome diet. What hinders us from surrounding ourselves with an abundance of those various articles of food which will promote health and produce longevity?
And he was just one of many church leaders to do so up to the present day. Wikipedia has a partial list.
The current president is 99, a former noted heart surgeon, and he occasionally encourages members to eat fruit, veggies, and whole grains, and to eat meat sparingly.
Dr. Diamond provided a reference to epidemiology and claimed it showed Mormons are actually the longest-lived population in the U.S. He must have a lot of confidence in epidemiology to make an emphatic statement like that. I, too, respect good epidemiology, and that was a decent study, but we should understand what it says, and it doesn't take any science to do so. It was a one-time questionnaire of white California Mormon high priests that they subdivided into what they called an optimal subgroup, married, never smokers who had at least 12 years of education. I know this cohort very well because I'm in it. I fell in love with a Mormon girl.
Hi.
The church adopted me, made me bishop of a congregation in California, which meant becoming a high priest and part of this cohort. Tony and I were actively involved until we felt the church crossed over from a purely religious community to a political one also. But we still participate in purely charitable activities they sponsor, and we maintain many dear Mormon friends. The majority of the cohort from the paper lived in relatively wealthy, low-mortality zip codes around the Oakland and Los Angeles temples, as we do. They further divided the optimal subgroup into even more optimal ones. Mormons who had moderate BMIs, had regular exercise, and proper sleep. That narrowed it to about 2,300 men, and that's how they got a life expectancy of 84 years. Adventist epidemiology is on a whole different level. Their latest study had a cohort of almost 100,000 Adventists across North America, including heavy participation from high mortality states in the South, followed for 20 years and funded by the NIH. Adventists are only 37% white, with 34% being black and 14% Hispanic, both of whom have lower life expectancies. Unlike the Mormon study, which had no information about diet, the Adventist study had very detailed dietary information. As you'd expect from a large population like that, people vary in their adherence to the church's advice to eat a diet of veggies, fruit, whole grains, legumes, and nuts in as close to their natural state as possible. The differences in BMI, rate of diabetes, etc. vary dramatically according to the diet that they followed. Dr. Diamond referenced Zoe Harcum and Belinda Fetke about these studies, but sadly there's a lot of misinformation from them too. For example, do you remember the 22-country graph from the last episode where Dr. Diamond claimed there was no correlation, but the statistician authors actually reported the correlation coefficient? And it was significant, not weak. Dr. Diamond may have gotten that from Zoe.
And when you put in all of those countries, it just looked like a scatter plot. There was no clear relationship.
No correlation between fat and heart disease.
My interpretation of the Adventist studies is that, like Mormons, white Adventists in California are the longest lived among them. There is a selection of white Mormon men in California who average roughly 84 years. The ones who are most active in the church are married, have at least 12 years of education, exercise, sleep well, and keep their BMIs under control. Likewise, white California Adventist men also average about 84 years, but the only selection criteria is whether they're vegetarian. I did interview a 100-year-old Adventist nutrition professor for people who want more insight. He is vegetarian from birth, not unusual among Adventists.
In the last episode, Dr. Diamond made the claim
He had no education at all in heart disease or nutrition. He had a bachelor's degree in economics and a PhD in oceanography.
And I pointed out that Ancel got a second PhD in physiology from Cambridge, among other things. Dr. Diamond came back with a lot of ad hominem about Keys, but he did make a specific claim. He said Ancel wrote in his autobiography that he was surprised to be invited to develop K-rations given his lack of nutrition expertise. I couldn't find that in his autobiography, which I'm converting to a searchable PDF and will put online. But I could find this clip.
I had an urgent message from the War Department, and they wanted me to do something on diet. I didn't have no idea why they did that, but the net result was that I was appointed a special assistant to the Secretary of War.
I'm not sure what that means. There are several very respected scientists like Jean-Pierre Montani, the chairman of the physiology department at the University of Fribourg in Switzerland, and Joseph Dixon, professor of lipidology at Rutgers, who have done very deep dives on Ancel Keys' career. They point out that the answer to Ancel's question is found in a case of correspondence from the War Department in the archives of the University of Minnesota. The War Department explained that what they were looking for was light, calorie-dense provisions for use with paratroopers who were exposed to high altitudes.
3 men were needed to help one paratrooper on board who had a 50% chance of survival and who knew it.
Because Ancel was so highly regarded for his high-altitude physiology studies that he had conducted with a large team of respected scientists, which led to 21 publications and 2 book chapters, they wanted him. They were so impressed they expanded the use of K-rations to the infantry. But what if what Dr. Keys was saying in those early days is that he did have doubts about his background in nutrition? Isn't what's really important what he accomplished over the next 5 decades? The paper Dr. Montani wrote after his deep dive is entitled The Legacy of a Giant in Physiology, Nutrition, and Public Health. I know another scientist who sometimes expresses his lack of background in heart disease and nutrition, and I applaud him for it.
I will share with you that I feel a bit like the elephant on the stage in this cartoon. Elephant's invited to give a piano recital, and he says, "What am I doing here? I play the flute." The reason why I feel a bit like that is that most of the introduction you just heard was about neuroscience. And so that's my career, is really a study of brain and memory. But I'm not going to talk about the brain and memory. I'm talking about a completely different area, which is cardiovascular disease, nutrition, cholesterol, and health. And so it's clearly something very new to me. And so you might wonder, what motivates me to take on a second, completely different area?
There is so much more to Dr. Diamond's response, which is filled with ad hominem and pejoratives and accusations of an agenda. Honestly, I don't mind that, but it does feel like noise, and I have a plane to catch with the kids to Japan.
So I'm not scoring any family points by YouTubing on vacation, but I did promise to cover a couple of vitally important points that Dr. Diamond made in later presentations. I'll pick some points that don't require any science to understand.
And for those of you who have seen my other talks, I've made fun of Lipitor before, and today for the first time I'm going to make fun of Crestor. So we've got this ad, and the doctor is so happy, you're lowering your cholesterol, and here this woman is just so overjoyed, and she's lowered her risk of having a heart attack by 54%. And so this is a slide from a CME course showing how dramatic the benefit was for Crestor in the Jupiter study. And in fact, it was this effect that resulted in rapid FDA approval of Crestor.
I should explain what the Jupiter study was. It's very simple. It was designed to study people with LDL of 130 or below, and in 2008, when the study completed, that was considered a safe number. That guidance has since been lowered to 100 for generally healthy people in the US and 70 if you have another risk factor like diabetes. The one risk factor of interest in the Jupiter study was moderately elevated high-sensitivity C-reactive protein, HSCRP. I asked a doctor about that.
So high-sensitivity C-reactive protein is a marker of inflammation which has been closely associated with the likelihood of developing atherosclerosis over the course of time. It's not as generic as the C-reactive protein in general, and it's a good indication, particularly in a healthier population, about their relative cardiac risk.
The Jupiter trial was funded by AstraZeneca because they're the makers of Crestor, so appropriate yellow flags. Crestor is known to reduce LDL and C-reactive protein. But drug trials are highly regulated, so this was a double-blind, randomized, placebo-controlled trial of 17,000 participants in 265 locations around the world, led by a very respected group of scientists. A key thing to know about this trial is an independent ethics committee voted to stop it after 1.9 years because the results were so significant, as Dr. Diamond pointed out. They thought it would be unethical to leave people on a placebo for the full 5 years the trial was authorized for, since the Crestor group performed so much better.
So what I'm going to show you now is the percent of people in the Jupiter study that did not have a heart attack. Okay, and that's right there. And so there is a 54% risk reduction between these two. The percent of people that did not have a heart attack. And I just love this little guy because this is the same look I'm getting from all of you. So understand something. Over 99% of the people in this study were horribly uncooperative. They didn't have a heart attack. Almost no one in the study had a heart attack. Almost no one in the study died. And I've drawn that line at 99% so you can see that the percent of people that did not have a heart attack is over 99%. And yet, there is a 54% reduction in the incidence of heart attacks. So let's see how they did that. Here are the real data. You got almost 18,000 people in this study, and less than 100 overall had a heart attack. So on the left, you're seeing the group that got Crestor. 31 people out of 8,901 had a heart attack, 0.35%. The placebo group, 68 out of 8,901, 0.76% had a heart attack. Less than 1% of the people had a heart attack. So how is it that you can have a 54% reduction? The difference between 0.76 and 0.35 is 0.41. 0.41 is 54% of 0.76.
The first point I'll make is significant, but the second point is the elephant in the room. First, he picked a subset of the study's results to minimize the apparent risk. The study included more than heart attacks, also strokes, bypass surgeries, hospitalization for angina. The numbers of patients affected by serious outcomes combined was 142 for the Crestor group, more than 4 times what he listed. And for the placebo group, it was 251, far above the 68 he listed.
Here's the elephant in the room. What he never mentioned is that is for 1.9 years. He is speaking about absolute risk, and absolute risk absolutely depends on the duration of time. Think about it. Do you think we really have a 1% chance of succumbing to the nation's biggest killer, which takes something like 30% of us?
What did you think?
That was great.
You can see the baby in there.
That was great, yeah.
I just thought it was random and fun.
The Jupiter study is reporting that in people whose risk of heart attacks is low, in other words, the people they selected for the study, the risk is 2.2% for just 1.9 years.
So let me get this straight. If I'm a safe driver and I haven't had an accident over the last 1.9 years, then that means I don't even need to wear a seatbelt for the rest of my life.
The Harvard School of Public Health explains, while most adults have low short-term risk of heart disease, 2/3 of them have high lifetime risk. There is a great book about absolute risk by statisticians and epidemiologists who know this stuff that you can rent cheaply on Amazon for a month. You don't need any science for the preface and first chapter, and if you're a geek with math skills, you can go as deep as you like. The book describes very sophisticated absolute risk calculators for things like breast cancer and heart disease. Some of them take into account many factors like where you live, your age, weight, genetic predisposition, and other risk factors. The Mayo Clinic has a simple, consumer-accessible 10-year heart disease risk calculator. I entered the median numbers for the male volunteers in the Jupiter study, and their 10-year risk was 14.2%. After my recent blood test with much better numbers, I still got an 11% risk. My biggest risk is my age, 70, the same age my dad and sister died of heart attacks. I repeated the calculation but fibbed and said I was 66, and the answer was still 8% risk. Now imagine your 20 or 30-year risk. I assure you, you're not going to get the low-risk number that Dr. Diamond is claiming here.
We are talking about a fraction of a percent. If you do nothing, in fact, if you're a prescriber and your patient comes to you, and you would be like the patients in Jupiter, and the patient asks you, if I do nothing, if I don't take the medication, what's the likelihood I'm going to have a heart attack? The real number you can give to that person is about 0.76% chance of having a heart attack if you do nothing. And so, in fact, you think about this called number needed to treat. So that 54% can translate to how many people need to be treated with Crestor to stop one person from having one heart attack. And that is 220 people need to be treated to stop one heart attack in one person. Okay. Incredibly weak effects. Imagine, Ivor, if we had a vaccine that week that affected...
Once again, by eliminating strokes and bypass surgeries and only looking at 1.9 years, he made it seem like the risk was much lower than it is. But the paper did look at strokes and longer time periods. When you consider all the serious cardiovascular events the paper recorded, the number needed to treat falls to 95 for 2 years, not 238. Extrapolating out to 4 years, it becomes 31. You see how quickly it falls with time? Now imagine most 50 and 60-year-olds are hoping to live 30 more years, and imagine how far the number needed to treat falls over that time period. Many YouTubers say they won't give medical advice, but I am happy to give it. My advice is to seek a medical professional who actually understands absolute risk. For example, maybe you want to choose Dr. Bellardo, an actual cardiologist. I don't know her, but I listen to her podcast and she regularly clears up internet misinformation. Yes, she's been vegan for a very long time, as many leading cardiologists are, but she doesn't demand it of her patients and doesn't make exaggerated claims that veganism offers 100% protection from heart disease. Dr. Diamond goes on to claim that statins have side effects like poor cognition that negate their benefits. I could do a whole episode on that, but I can't make a forever episode out of this one. But I will link a respected paper in the description that doesn't come to that conclusion. Yes, statins do somewhat increase the risk of diabetes, as the Jupiter study showed. So if you can get your LDL down via lifestyle, that's a much better plan than medications. But studies show the downsides of the diabetes risk are much lower than the risk of a cardiovascular event. To many of Dr. Diamond's supporters, the concern over LDL comes down in part to Big Pharma profits. I read John Abramson's amazing book, Sickening, How Big Pharma Broke American Healthcare, so I don't trust Big Pharma any more than I trust most food giants. But what Dr. Diamond doesn't mention is how genetic studies show that a few of our genes, the ones that control our LDL levels naturally, have a dramatic effect on our risk of heart disease. Big Pharma does not control the genes your parents gave you. And not understanding those genes is a huge source of misinformation on the internet. How many times have you seen the comment that someone's grandmother ate bacon and lived to 96 and died water skiing?
Can you believe this water skier is 90 years old? Yes, that's 90.
So they conclude everyone should eat bacon. What they don't know is what LDL receptor genes their water skiing granny got at birth. And that bit of misinformation leads many people to lose their lives in their late 30s or 40s because they didn't get Granny's genes and believed her anecdote proved that bacon is fine. Now for the question I haven't been able to stop thinking about for 2 weeks. In the previous episode, there was so much very obvious misinformation from Dr. Diamond, and I don't think I saw a single person from the low-carb community acknowledge any of it. Instead, they simply pressed the like button on Dr. Diamond's Twitter response to me. The guests on my channel have represented many diet communities, including Mediterranean, Asian, vegetarian, low carb, and all the different stripes of vegan. There must be at least a dozen of them, from environmentalists to animal rights activists to cardiologists and brain scientists, from chemists who are concerned about the accumulation of PFAS chemicals in animal foods. I have never known any of them to be reluctant to call out misinformation from members of their communities. In my bewilderment, I watched a fascinating new TED Talk from Peter McIndoe about how conspiracies take flight.
What if, by addressing Belief before belonging. We're starting the conversation at the wrong place. How much does it have to do with a different truth? Or how much does it have to do with the community that truth brings? Let's direct our energy toward the crisis of belonging, and then maybe we will understand the crisis of belief.
It made me ponder other communities I've been involved in. I started a large adventure motorcycle community, and our mantra is all the gear, all the time. Harley introduced an adventure motorcycle and I reviewed it, so I ended up engaged in Harley communities where their mantra is as little gear as possible. In my community, we believe helmets prevent head injuries at the risk of creating a few more neck injuries. In the Harley community, their mantra is helmets create neck injuries and head injuries aren't much of a thing. Head injury data doesn't matter. It's membership in the community that matters to them, and helmets are not cool. I thought of other communities I've been involved in. The culture of Mormons is to be positive and not criticize church leaders, which helps elevate the leaders to rock star status in the community.
Let us talk about life. That's something with which I've had a little experience.
Dr. Bikman has different views from church leaders, but he doesn't criticize them. As I pondered other communities I've been involved in, I could think of others like that, but I've never seen a scientific community like that. Stunned as I am to hear these words come from my mouth, it feels like that is the culture of the low-carb community. Dr. Diamond is a rock star in the low-carb community who gets millions of views. And as he said in one of his interviews, hardly anyone has ever pushed back on him.
You've put yourself out there to really help move this forward, and you've gotten a lot of attacks for it. I mean, has your skin really thickened from this? And
actually, I'm not sure what attacks you're talking about. I think in general the statin advocates have ignored to a great extent the people who have been critics. I know it came out, there was an article in the UK paper recently specifically criticizing Zoe Hartcomb, Malcolm Kendrick, Ufi Ravenscoff. They left me out, I guess, because I'm not a UK person. But that article was truly awful.
If he's talking about this article in the Sunday Daily Mail entitled "The Deadly Propaganda of the Statin Deniers," I was surprised to see how solid it was. Who knew the Sunday Mail has a highly regarded health editor, Barney Kalman?
And the winner is Barney Kalman. Thank you very much.
The Sunday Daily Mail actually published a series of 3 articles about it, and both Malcolm and Zoe sued the Daily Mail for defamation. The preliminary trial concluded July 11th of 2023, but I haven't heard a verdict. It's quite a war of words, with the Daily Mail referring to them as statin deniers and them referring to mainstream doctors and scientists as statin pushers, apparently to connote drug pushers. The Daily Mail interviewed a who's who of scientists and doctors in the UK for their articles and had a letter signed by all 30 editors-in-chief of heart health journals, all cardiologists railing against dangerous misinformation about statins. The Daily Mail made the same point that I made in my previous episode, that a small number of influencers across almost every field creates the lion's share of doubt about science. You might wonder how Zoe and Malcolm, whose credentials seem weak in comparison to the Daily Mail's sources, could possibly prevail at the trial. But suits like this are very effective at squelching debate because of the cost of defense. And it's very hard for judges and juries to render a solid verdict because they're not scientists. For example, I'm told that some people are considering a suit against me for episodes like this one. The thing is, anyone can sue for any reason or no reason, even if they're on the public record for provably false and defamatory statements. When I see long-time low-carb experts like Dr. Malcolm Kendrick struggle with their weight, I think of the many bold promises. For example, that just by eliminating carbs, you can eat whatever you want and be slim with good metabolic health over the long term. Or if you're on a low-carb diet and have high LDL, a statin isn't warranted. Those issues are very personal to me because I have many dear Mormon friends who decided to abandon the church teachings because they love Dr. Bikman and decided to celebrate a life of steak and butter.
There's no reason whatsoever for humans to be attempting to get protein from plants. It is a fool's errand. Humans can live a carnivore diet and live and thrive. Humans cannot live a purely plant-based diet. It is impossible.
They lost weight over the first year partly by eliminating cookies, which is good. But over the subsequent years, the weight came back, a pattern this very rigorous study and its follow-up observed over 6 years comparing Mediterranean and low-carb diets. The thing is, our friends LDL soared too, among other markers, but they believe they're safe because they're on low-carb diets, so they refuse the statins. My perspective is bold claims like that should be backed up by long-term data of large populations with mortality as an endpoint, not just short-term studies with blood tests of a few people. We do have solid long-term data for millions of people over decades for diets like the Mediterranean and for hundreds of thousands of people via more than 50 different studies for LDL being a causal factor in heart disease. And yet, after 150 years of low-carb dieting, the Statins Are Not Warranted paper by Drs. Diamond and Bikman is based on shaky short-term studies of small populations.
I do recall that there was a cardiologist, actually at Duke University, who wrote an op-ed specifically about me, saying that I was causing harm to her patients, that people would die because I was explaining how statins have adverse effects and overall the adverse effects are greater than the benefits, to which I wrote a rebuttal to that cardiologist's reply. So yes, there was one example I can think of in which I personally have been attacked.
I think that is how misinformation spreads. No one from any diet community has ever been shy about pushing back on me, and I think that is so valuable for getting as close to the truth as we can. Thank you for watching this crazy episode. I wanted a break from episodes like this, so I got caught up with a group of chemists who are concerned about the rise of chemicals in food.
PFAS are known as the forever chemicals because they just don't break down.
I think people just aren't aware that toxic chemicals are in our food and primarily in animal foods.
They are ubiquitous now.
Yikes! Buckle your seatbelts for that episode when I get back from Japan.